Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Hedgehog After Hours. My name is Kyle Edward Williams, and I'm an editor at the Hedgehog Review, which is a journal of ideas and cultural analysis. The Hedgehog Review is published by the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture at the University of Virginia. It's an interdisciplinary research center and community that seeks to understand cultural change in the modern world. And I'm glad to be joined by my friend Paul Nedelisky. Paul, how are you doing?
Doing great. How you doing, Kyle?
Doing good. Paul's a philosopher by training, and he is assistant director at the Institute. And he's going to introduce our guests, so I'll hand it off to Paul.
Thanks, Kyle. Yeah, we're excited to have Joe Davis with us tonight. Joe is research professor of sociology at the University of Virginia and the chair of the Human Person Colloquy here at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture. And he's authored several books and a number of articles, including the one we'll be talking about tonight, Chemically Imbalanced. And we'll hop right into the discussion, but first I wanted to say a few words about the format. Joe will start things off with a 5 to 10 minute overview of the book, the argument, what he is doing there. And then probably, just because I can't help myself, I'll ask the first question. But then I encourage everyone watching, if you have a question, use the ask questions, the Q&A function in your Zoom interface, and those will pop up in a little screen, and I or Kyle will ask those questions of Joe. And if you want, include your name if you don't mind being acknowledged. If you prefer to keep it anonymous, you don't have to put your name. Yeah, so anytime you have a question, type it in, and that'll show up for us, and we'll draw upon those as we can. But I think that's it for me. Joe, if you don't mind, introduce us to your book and tell us what it's about.
Oh, great. Thank you. Thank you very much, both of you guys and the Hedgehog Review for doing this. I think, as you guys know, this book appeared and got kind of submarined by the COVID. And the press warehouse was closed for like a year after the book was published. So it was kind of bad timing. So I'm happy to talk about it. And I don't think anything in it is dated. So in that sense, it's fresh, I think, now. So the book was an exploration of a shift in kind of interpretation that people have about mental health struggles, if you will. And I first got interested in this topic, or I think one of the reasons had to do with drug advertising. You began to see, like in, say 2005, 6, 7, those years, which showed and argued that the antidepressants, for instance, corrected some kind of chemical imbalance, and that's how they worked, and then it kind of introduced the idea that depression or anxiety or lots of different things might be caused by a chemical imbalance. And then the first survey I saw was about 2007, I think, which suggested that actually a majority of Americans thought that depression and other things had biological causes, including this idea of a chemical imbalance. And so I decided to investigate this and the kind of shift that had in the way that people understood things previously. And in my book, in the chapter 2 of the book, I tell the story of kind of how everyday suffering becomes biologized. This idea of chemical balance gets introduced, and so on. But there'd clearly been a change from what you might call more psychological understanding toward a more biological. So I designed an interview study to investigate, see how people interpreted their struggles, why they did so, and then with what consequences that they might have. It was an interview study, and I posted ads on like Craigslist. Remember when that was a thing? I don't know if it still is, but it was then.
That's dating the book.
Yeah, that's right. When we
It'd be
started
TikTok today, right?
project, and we used some city-like newspapers, posted some flyers at different places, and did the interviews in, we did some in Chicago and in Boston, in Charlottesville area, over in the Valley, Shenandoah Valley. So we're aiming actually for somewhat more rural people, though we ended up getting college students over there. And yeah, so Chicago. Anyway, so we did it in several cities. And the way I advertised it was asking people who were, if they struggled with being anxious in social situations, being sad, or being distracted, right? So they had some kind of problem with those things, and would they be willing to talk about it? And those three things kind of relate roughly to conditions like social anxiety disorder or depression or ADHD. So those were kind of the correlates, but we didn't ask about we didn't name disorders. We just used the kind of general category. And then there was an 800 number they could call to be pre-screened. And the main point of the pre-screening was to rule out people with serious mental illness. Okay. And I'll say in a minute the distinction I'm making between serious mental illness and what I call everyday suffering. But so in the pre-screening thing, if they had ever suffered from something like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, if they were taking a drug like an antipsychotic, or had ever been hospitalized, and a few other things, those are the ways. So if they were dealt with those kind of things, we didn't interview them. So it wasn't. So I was making a distinction, and this is a hard distinction to stand up to, because there aren't sharp lines here. But the distinction I was trying to make is between mental disorder, serious mental illness, or mental disorder, something that arises from a kind of dysfunction within the self or the brain, and then what I was calling everyday suffering, where everyday didn't mean routine, it meant kind of the practical and felt experience of ordinary people. It's kind of the life world that we live in, is the everyday. And so this was suffering that arose from struggles in one's everyday life that are painful, quite painful. So I use the word suffering advisedly, right? So it wasn't that these were just trivial of things; they were actually suffering, but not a mental illness. So that's the distinction I was trying to draw. We did interviews in 80 interviews. The youngest person was 18, the oldest was 65, with a kind of mix across those, men and women, white and minorities, lower and middle class, and so on. So we tried to get a kind of mix. It's called a purposive sample. Interview studies like this are not representative. So there's no claim here of representativeness. Though what I did try to do, and it's in the footnotes of the book, is compare what we were finding with other kind of national survey data and other kinds of things. So that, and what we generally found was consistent with that. So it wasn't, this was some idiosyncratic group that was unusual, but it seemed pretty, again, not representative, but a pretty good purposive sample. And then then really there were two groups in the interviews. One, and it was about half the people, interpreted their suffering in terms of some problem with their brain. Again, usually a chemical imbalance explanation. Some used genetic, wiring. There were some different things. But the idea was that something was wrong with their brain, and that the reason they were having their struggle was because of some kind of problem with their brain. And virtually all of these people had a diagnosis and were on medication. Okay. And a lot, and by the way, had also been in psychotherapy, either previously or at the time of the interview. So then the other group, who gave a more psychological interpretation. So the problems relate kind of to the mind, not so much the brain, but the mind. And so it might be a problem with their personality, with the way they were, their past experience in their life, struggles they were having in the present, say relationship struggles, things like that. So they tended to give what I'm calling just a more psychological interpretation of their experience. Some of these people were on medication. So the medication itself didn't necessarily dictate that they would have a brain interpretation. So some were, but thought about their struggles in this more psychological way. It's sometimes said, this was that Peter Kramer's famous book, Listening to Prozac, was the idea that if you took a drug, so you took a physical thing, that somehow that led to the interpretation that you have a physical problem. But people that doesn't seem to be the case. They learned about a chemical imbalance somewhere and did that, but just the fact of taking a medication didn't seem to have that effect. And then, when I was studying past drug use, people used psychotropic drugs from the 50s when most of these things were discovered to the 80s without any biological interpretation. Again, ordinary people, not psychiatrists, began to think differently, and researchers, but ordinary people continued to think in terms of biology or in terms of psychology for their struggles, not so much in terms of biology. And in fact, for a long time, till the publisher just refused, I was calling the book After Psychology. And one can see how that would create a lot of confusion. And so that's why I didn't go. But the idea was that in kind of the popular imagination, we're moving from a kind of psychological way of thinking about ourselves to a more biological way of thinking in terms of brains and brain problems, etc. And I still like that title better than Chemically Imbalanced. But anyway, the press was pretty clear that they weren't going to go with that. So then I use these two groups for kind of comparison purposes. And I'll kind of wind up, but let me say about one of the things I found, and that was pretty consistent, was what I dubbed a neurobiological imaginary. An imaginary being just, how we kind of imagine things. So sort of background, sort of assumptions about ourselves or about our place in the world that we make, and that the neurobiological, again, was a way of imagining ourselves. And it had kind of three elements that different, across the 80 interviews, not many people didn't share at least one of these points of view, even if they had a more psychologizing thing. And a lot of people had two, or some had all three of them. One was the assumption that the brain is actually the malfunctioning brain is what kind of mechanistically throws off symptoms. And of course, that was most strongly held by those with by about half the sample. Then the second one, though, was the tendency to view things like psychotherapy or counseling, or what you might think of as some kind of dialogic way of thinking about struggles, is taking a very kind of dim view of that. It's kind of useless. You don't really, it's a bunch of talk and so on. So a lot of people had a kind of dim view of that way of thinking about problems in the kind of interpretive mode of, say, therapy. And then the third one, which was really common, was the view that medication is the real solution to problems. Even people who weren't taking a medication often then would give a reason why they weren't. But it seemed that they viewed that as that would be the normal thing that people would do, is you take a medication. That's the effective thing. So these kind of three elements, those three, that's what I was calling a neurobiological imaginary. And it seemed like generally people nowadays are have really shifted in this direction, and again away from other kinds of interpretation. So anyway, that's kind of the rough idea of the study um, and what I was trying to find. And anyway, I'm happy to then get into the meat and potatoes of it. But that was the study.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah. What are the kind of your eventual thesis or one of your insights that you were able to find by talking to these people? To me, it's so interesting. I almost hate to say it out loud. I feel like I'm spoiling a movie for everyone. But it's this recognition you had that it seemed that for many of the people you talked to, the role that the medication that they were taking was playing in their coping, they're dealing with their everyday suffering, wasn't really about the kind of chemical effects it had on their mood or the way in which it maybe stabilized them or helped them overcome grief. Although that some would talk about those effects. But instead, it seemed that for some people, as you were able to sort of divine from the way they talked about their problems, it was more that being diagnosed as having some kind of problem and the sort of validation that came from being given medicine for this problem they had, it enabled them to sort of justify or explain to themselves some of the problems they were having. Because in many of the cases, it seemed the kinds of problems people were having related to their own sense that they were letting themselves down or letting loved ones down or letting society down. There were these standards they had internalized that they wanted to live up to. Maybe they wanted to be more productive. They wanted to be a world beater. They wanted to be excellent and to succeed like apparently everyone else but them. How do you explain that to yourself? Am I a failure? Am I doing something wrong? You told the story. This one young woman was saying, I just don't have enough self-discipline. That's what my parents say. That's my problem. I'm not disciplined enough. But once they have this diagnosis, at least in many of the cases, there's almost this sense of relief. It's like, this is why it's not working. And it's not because I have some moral failing. It's probably not because I have some character vice of laziness or something like that. I have a chemical imbalance, and it's almost like, go ahead, Kyle.
I was just going to say it's the only kind of diagnosis that people are happy to get. I mean, nobody greets a cancer diagnosis as being affirmative. But I was struck by the same thing over and over again. There seems like this relief. There's a relief at getting a diagnosis. But I interrupted you. Go ahead, Paul.
No, that's exactly right. And to me, that's one of the most revealing and interesting things about the book. And the way one thought I had, I think this is saying the same thing, but in slightly different language. You hear about the idea of theodicies, the intellectual challenge of justifying God's way to man. It seemed like what a lot of people were looking for in some ways was sort of a theodicy of the self, to justify their own ways to themselves and maybe to their community. But it's just an interesting diagnosis of its own sort that I think you were able to make. I mean, does that seem accurate? This way of characterizing one of your conclusions, Joe? I don't want to get it wrong.
Yeah, no, it certainly does, Paul. Yeah, most of the everyday suffering is really a question of a kind of disturbed self. The most common kind of predicaments that people talked about, right, were around kind of feelings of being inadequate, not being enough, right, not having, their career isn't going that well, school's not going that well, they're not standing out in some way, they haven't achieved certain objectives and goals, and so on. They were in various kind of relationship struggles where they had like invested too much relative to the other person, and so and they've been hurt by that. Things like that. I mean, that was the substance of these struggles were, again, these kind of everyday problems, and in some sense, in a kind of sociological register, mental struggles in some ways are kind of norm violations, or you're not being enough. You feel struggling because you're not enough. You're not whatever. But and so so the problem was really how to explain these problems, how to account for them, and the way that people talked then was that, and there seemed to be only two options, right? It's either you're a problem, you've got a broken self, right, or you need something external to the self to explain it, and I think that was the gist of why there was a kind of relief in a diagnosis, is that, oh, it's not, I don't have a failed self, right? I've got these problems. I don't know why I have them. I don't want them. You've been trying to overcome things, say, to get along or to get over a relationship breakup or whatever the case might be. But I think the value, if you will, of a diagnosis was in relieving that sense, providing an explanation that had some kind of quasi authority behind it because it was medical, or at least they thought it was. No one had any idea what a chemical imbalance meant. I asked them, but it didn't really matter. It wasn't just that they didn't understand it. I typically got the sense that they weren't interested really in knowing. It was like, oh, there's some science back there. But I thought that had to do partly with what the point of the diagnosis was not some elaborate explanation in that sense, but rather because it was there, it helped relieve this sense of that I'm kind of a failed self, and that the diagnosis then takes that burden off of me, as you put it.
Yeah, no, that's. We have a question here from our friend Gary Fine. Joe, you're talking about psychological and biological explanations, but he's wondering about sociological explanations. He asks, how does, in terms of the people you're talking to, how does their family, marriage, friends, parents, or community matter in their explanation of their suffering that they feel? Do they ever attribute their pain to the people that they're with? And that, kind of think, well, maybe I should just find new people to hang out with, find a new community.
um, yeah, almost no one actually did that. Yeah, I can't. I mean, people who have relationship struggles that they talked about, but they didn't usually attribute their struggles to that other person or even to their immediate environment, even when they saw it as problematic. In fact, I think one of the consequences of a kind of biological explanation is precisely that the environment disappears because the problem is inside your head. And so, yeah, so I didn't hear really, or at least I can't remember any what you might call a sociological interpretation of their experience.
I'm thinking about one of the vignettes you shared. There was a young woman who, like a lot of these people, she was in kind of a crisis, and her crisis was caused by her boyfriend. She found out her boyfriend was cheating on her, and they hadn't even been together that long. But one of the things that you reported she was saying is she was kind of mad at herself for being so hurt about it and blaming herself. And she would say things like, "I should be mad at him. Why am I not thinking this is his fault? He's the one who's messed up, and I didn't do anything wrong." But she couldn't get in that headspace, and her friends would have kept encouraging her to get in that headspace, and she just felt like she couldn't do it. But that seems to bear out.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, because in her case, right, what was just the everyday suffering in some sense wasn't the end of the relationship. It was her response to it, right? And she's like, look, girls like me do not respond to boys in that way, right? And so we're strong, we're self-sufficient, and so on. And so, within about 30 days of the breakup, she was actually on a medication for anxiety. So in that case, yeah, that and maybe that's a good point in general. So that even when there was kind of relational issues, the relational issues weren't necessarily the suffering. The suffering had to do with one's own response, like not getting over it quickly enough or something like that. So it was something about the self that was the problem, not necessarily what was out and around them. And hence this kind of disturbed self, and then the feeling like something's wrong with me, right? I shouldn't be responding in this way. There's something wrong with me, and then the chemical explanation being a way to kind of resolve that. Like, oh, it's not really, it's me, but it's my brain, which isn't me, which isn't the self, right? That way you have the brain or the self, and so you relieve, so the brain gets the blame.
Gotcha. More questions? Oh, go ahead, Kyle.
Well, I was just going to jump in here. We had a comment here from someone who raises this question about where these ideas come from, right? This neurobiological imaginary, in many ways, treats the mind as a kind of machine, right? The brain is malfunctioning, the solution being in this pharmacological instrument. And the commenter says the distinction between mental suffering and mental illness seems especially poorly delineated today, since younger generations are both keen to identify with a mental illness and vulnerable to social media influencers. In that category of social media influencers, you could also think about other explanations too, right? That perhaps there's just more access to the mental health care system or to psychiatrists as providers. It could be the circulation of ideas about the mind, about medicine, about the self, could be in the larger culture. It could also, I could see being influenced just by the availability of some of these drugs. You had an anecdote early in the book, I think in the introduction, about a young woman who encountered, I think it was Adderall at a party. And so, for a couple of decades at least now, a lot of these drugs are pretty widely available. So I'm curious to know what is your view about why this imaginary has come to be so credible to so many people?
Well, there's a little bit longer history that way that these drugs kind of began to come on the market in the 1950s. First with the antipsychotics, and then you had Ritalin, you had the first antidepressants, and so on. Miltown, which was the first blockbuster drug, which was a tranquilizer, we call the minor tranquilizer. It's the precursor then to the benzodiazepines like Valium and Librium and so on that came on the market in the early 60s, and so on. They're still around with like Xanax and Ativan and so on. But there was a kind of move that I'll try to make this a short answer. But so the idea is that you were taking a chemical, and that the chemical was somehow having these effects. And then the question was, how could that be possible? And so on. And so then you work backwards from the kind of the chemical to if the chemical is a physical thing, then there must be some kind of brain impairment that it's somehow correcting, right? And the first serotonin talk and dopamine talk goes all the way back to the 50s. So that idea eventually, right, and then begin to test the drugs, and there's a whole series of developments in which you have a kind of biologizing of mental disorder categories. The big revolution is in 1980 with the third edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, where you really move toward I would say, a kind of biologized view of mental disorder. But it really begins to escape psychiatry in the 80s, especially with the introduction of Prozac, which was on the cover of every magazine. You had books like Peter Kramer's bestseller and how this is transforming people and all this kind of stuff. And then you begin to see the drug ads, direct-to-consumer advertising comes on about 97 or 8, I believe. You get the relaxing so that you can have direct-to-consumer ads on TV and in magazines and on radio and so on. And then you really begin to, so you're now advertising the drugs directly to the public. And this has a huge educational effect. Everybody starts to hear about these drugs, see ads for them, hear about serotonin and imbalances and all that kind of talk. And a lot of people I interviewed had first encountered this talk, or at least had seen, drug ads or things like that, and so on. They can, on TV or now more recently on social media and so on. They're targeted. It became kind of common knowledge. A lot of people learned about the drugs from family or friends who would say, there's a drug for that, or, I tried this. And so you get the circulation of knowledge. In that way, you have all kind of public service things, and depression screening days, anxiety screening days, etc. People go to their doctor, they hear about chemical imbalances from doctors, and so on. So it kind of escaped, and now it's all over social media. These, ADHD has billions of views on TikTok, ADHD videos, and so on. So it's kind of escaped and become kind of part of our broader culture now, and the way we think and talk, and what constitutes a diagnostic criteria. You can go on TikTok and kids will say, "Oh, did you know that being chatty is a symptom of ADHD?" They like making up new symptoms that they add. A lot of this has nothing to do with the DSM or with psychiatry per se. It's just become kind of popular folklore. I don't know what you call it.
A new folk psychology.
Folklore is Gary's area, but Gary Fine's area. But so that kind of, it's really out there. And again, it does a lot of work, as we've talked about how it kind of explains difference, explains struggles, and so on. And so it's a kind of an attractive account, even if you never take the medication. It's still, although again, usually once you start talking like that, or if you go to a doctor, a lot of people end up on a medication. But that's what I'm thinking about.
Yeah.
There's a lot of avenues. Yeah. This stuff is really out there. It's no longer controlled really by medicine or limited to medical encounters or anything like that. It's really heavily popular talk.
I've got a spicier take here. Let me ask this question from Charles from Ottawa, Ontario. He asks, was there any recognition on the medicalization side that SSRIs, since the advent of Prozac, have proven an abject failure? Depression and anxiety rates have doubled since the early 90s, yet SSRIs continue to be pushed. Did any interviewees make this connection?
Did any interviewees make the connection? No, not really. Now,
do you think that's true?
People's experience, especially if they've been on the drug for very long, was almost always a really kind of ambivalent story. Often, sometimes they'd taken the drug for a while and just stopped working. They'd often played around with different dosages up and down, trying to kind of titrate it to help. And they'd often gone on they changed SSRI, the SSRIs. That's just the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So that class of drugs, this is like Prozac and Paxil and Zoloft and Pristiq. And anyway, there's quite a few kinds now. That class of drugs that people had, been on different ones. So they might have started on Paxil and had a kind of bad reaction to it. So then they shift them over to Prozac. A lot of these drugs are, of course, on generic now, but brand names. And so it shifted. Lots of people are on more than one drug. Polypharmacy is now the pretty much the rule. Almost nobody is just on one psychotropic drugs. If you start one, you're often on a second one. And so on. So they did have plenty of bad experience, not necessarily the kind that they wanted to stop. Often they would still say it's helpful to them,
Mhm.
But it was a kind of ambivalent experience. And, um, uh, uh, and lots of studies have suggested, have raised this question of, if we're treating all this depression, why is it still going up? You don't actually seem to see much improvement. And this, I think the study's conclusion is that the drugs have been radically oversold. It's not that they're useless, just that they're not nearly as effective as we originally thought they might be. And there's a non-response. I don't know, at least 40% have no response to them, and et cetera. So it's the whole effectiveness question is kind of complicated, but
Well, it's also I think complicated by your own thesis, because it seems that maybe one upshot of what you're observing is the motivation for people to get these diagnoses and take these meds. It isn't just because of the chemical changes to their emotional state. There's this whole other aspect where it's kind of exculpatory, for their own sense that they're failing at life. And so I wonder, I figure just from the armchair, that has to play some role in the enduring interest in these medications, even when they don't seem to do what they're advertised in doing.
Yeah, and it's a complicated question whether a drug works. People say it's working, and what that means is, right, it's all connected to one's interpretation of one's experience, the sense of relief that one might have gotten from the fact that one now doesn't feel like it's their fault, or that they have an account to tell other people. They can say, "Oh, I'm suffering from depression," and there's some sick role benefits with that, meaning that you can, people give you a wider berth. So there's some benefits, so to speak. It's like having a note at school, right? I'm really sick. See, well, if you have a diagnosis and a medication, then see, I'm really, and so then so there's a lot of complicated things that go on for people. One story I tell is a guy who was teaching at a school that was a really high pressure environment, and he seemed really quite ill-equipped to deal with the environment. So he becomes very anxious and not sleeping at night and so on, having a very difficult time. And so he goes to the doctor, and the doctor, says, you've got, generalized anxiety disorder, and here's a medication for it. And again, he found a lot of value in it. But then he quits the job. So I interview him about a year and a half after he's started the drug. So he's right. And what was interesting is that he's talking about how much his life is better. But almost everything he says seemed to me not attributable to the drug, but attributable to his changed circumstances, right? He no longer had this anxiety job. In fact, he wasn't even working, right? His wife had a good job. And so, and he was like gardening and various things. And so, but he continued to talk about the drug as the drug was the thing that was really making the difference. And yet it seemed like, the change of circumstances. Anyway, it's all to say that there's this kind of complicated way to interpret drugs and so on. And I should mention, lots of people have had bad experiences with the drugs. I did not interview any, but there's a ton of, Twitter or X. There's whole worlds of, and if you Google Paxil, I haven't done it in a while, but the last time I did it, what came up was a whole bunch of lawsuits. The single most complained about drug to the World Health Organization in history are complaints about Paxil. So there is a lot of bad experience out there. There are different kind of, taking away of libido. There's problems with, kind of the getting off of the drug can be really difficult. There's something called serotonin syndrome and so on. So there are problems, and but it's just in my interviews and the people I interviewed, nobody they talked about these more common kind of problems of having, having to be on try different drugs and different doses. They talked about that kind of stuff, but not any bad side effects or bad reactions or anything like that. But again, my kind of study is not representative. If you did a genuinely representative survey of, say, or people on the medication, then you're going to get some percentage are going to have a bad experience or just go off it because they couldn't tolerate it.
A couple of folks are asking about maybe newer kinds of drugs and treatments that go beyond the source you talk about in the book. Ron Dworkin and someone else. Ron is asking about ketamine and hallucinogenics that are drawn from LSD and ecstasy. Did anybody that you interviewed have any experience with these things? If not, have you run into cases where people are using these since then? Somebody else asks about psilocybin.
Yeah.
Would your analysis be different in these cases, or is it premature to say?
So in talking with, and not in this book, I have talked with kids, students and so on, who use like Adderall without a prescription. And just one or two people who've done what's sometimes referred to as microdosing, which is to take something like mushrooms, like psilocybin, to at a kind of sub hallucinogenic level, so that if the flowers are talking to you, you took too much. And in those cases, it seems to operate a little like Adderall as a kind of stimulant that you use to increase your performance. Right? You can stay up longer, you can concentrate more, and stuff like that. I know things like ketamine, street drug, Special K. They're now testing, I think, relatively unsuccessfully as a treatment. I don't, but I'm out of my depth on the new psychedelics and stuff like that. But there's a lot of turning to those, which seems to me evidence that the existing drugs, however much they still hyped, aren't actually so good, and so we're looking for new things beyond antidepressants or the antipsychotics. I see a lot of ads now for adding an antipsychotic to your antidepressant if your antidepressant doesn't work well enough. And there's been a lot of those kind of ads and so on. So they seem to, there's a lot of discontent around the drugs for sure, and hoping that maybe we go back to the old favorites, but use them at some kind of medical dose that maybe they'll be helpful for mental struggles.
There are a couple of questions people are asking about. What did you observe, or what did people say, if anything, about the role or interaction of their faith or belonging to a religious community in their description and dealing with the their everyday suffering? Did that seem to play a role in their accounting?
Not too many, but then in the interview we didn't really have explicit questions about religious belief. So I wanted, and this was partly a kind of intentional, when you do, these are called a semi-structured interview, meaning that I come into the interview with a kind of some questions and some prompts, but then the point of it really is to just let them talk, and you use the questions as a way to get them going, and kind of stay on topic, and so on, and then let them answer questions. So I tried to be as kind of so you try to be kind of non-directive, let people tell their story, and so on. And incidentally, when we did do the interviews, I never introduced these disorder categories. When I asked people to tell me kind of what struggle was it that they volunteered for this study, and then to find out what their language was. And that was really interesting, because that's when you begin to see that people would distance themselves in various ways from some of this talk, and so on. But when it came to, and so some people just volunteered stuff about their religious faith, but it didn't I didn't, and then I might ask about it, but not really introduce it as a topic. Um, and and generally, again, this is non-representative, and you have too few cases to make generalizations. So take this with a grain of salt. But it did seem like people who had some kind of religious faith were more inclined to interpret their experience in some psychological frame.
Hmm.
And here, by psychological, I'm meaning everything different than a biological. uh, just any other account I'm calling psychological. But and some people like referred to New Age and other things that I'm sort of sticking in that category. But in other words, more a mind explanation that something, right, that they're thinking it was wrong, or that they're something about their experience and so on. So that the people who identified or expressed themselves in terms of religious belief um, tended not to appear in the biological category. But again, I wouldn't, and I can't think off the top of my head, though it must be there, what survey data on this question shows if, say religious people are more or less inclined to adopt kind of biological interpretations or take medication versus other things. Some people were seeing a pastoral counselor through their church,
Yeah.
although sometimes they got a drug through that person. So I don't know. I don't have a lot.
Sure.
I don't have a big, yeah. So yeah, anyway, you get it. A few thoughts.
Go ahead, Kyle.
Well, I wanted to ask you, Joe, what in your opinion is lost when people treat or understand, interpret their everyday problems, everyday suffering as sort of reductionistically as something that can be fixed with a drug, that can be interpreted as a malfunction of a brain machine.
Right.
It seems to me like one of the things that you're getting at is that there's a myth or an imaginary or an idea that you can eradicate suffering, or that you can sort of sidestep the difficult process of sort of reckoning with the everyday troubles that we all go through with a product. And so I just wonder if you could just talk for a couple of minutes about,
Yeah.
what's
Yeah,
the
yeah.
alternative here, and what's the problem? Why is this such a big deal?
Right. Well, a number of things that I found that were, kind of in comparing the two groups. That is, those who, the kind of psychologizers and the more biologizers, if you will. The way they interpret. There seem to be some real consequences to thinking of your experience in a kind of in brain terms. One was the way in which it did have the effect of your experience, right? Your day-to-day experience, your interactions in the world seem to be kind of displaced as of any importance um, because you've got a chemical imbalance. And that was understood, the balance itself was understood to somehow arise biologically. So it wasn't an imbalance that was caused by something in your environment. It was usually some genetic idea, say that you're predisposed to have a chemical imbalance and now you do, or whatever. So one's individual experience, one's encounters with the world, one's relationships, all of that seemed to just kind of disappear in the explanatory picture because now I've got an imbalance. And this is, I think, one of the reasons for kind of de-emphasizing things like therapy or talking with anyone was because they couldn't really do anything about an imbalance, right? If you have a physical problem and you go to the doctor and the doctor gives you something to treat the physical problem. And so some people said that they just stopped therapy because what was the point? You didn't really there was nothing to talk about. So that was one thing. And relatedly, it kind of silences the import of your emotions. Um, uh, Emotions are important for self-understanding. It's really how we kind of grasp what matters to us, right? Is what we're emotional about. And it was striking. I'd be in interviews with people, and they would just attribute every emotion, every bad emotion at least, to their anxiety or their depression, and so on. It almost never spoke about kind of complex emotions like resentment, say, or jealousy, or anything like that. It was all this kind of, right, I'm anxious, I'm anxious. No, and in the chemical imbalance, emotions have objects, right? They, you're anxious about something. Um, uh, but on this account, the emotions have no meaning at all. They're like thrown off mechanistically by something going wrong in the brain, and so you don't. There again, they're like nothing to talk about because, right? A kind of reflection on our emotions is one of the things that we would do in a kind of dialogical relationship with somebody, right? You sit down with a friend and you say, "God, I'm angry all the time." Right?
Yeah.
And you understand why. Why are you angry? You're angry about something. What is the thing you're angry about? Which isn't always obvious. We can be mistaken about that. We may decide, no, that characterization was wrong. It's actually some other thing, or whatever. But that's how we kind of come to sort of articulate our emotions and understand them, understand what's happening to us, why we're experiencing these things, and so on. That was all really truncated, right? They don't mean anything, right? They're just coming off of you, and so on. So that was one. Another was to kind of uh, 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 demote, or whatever the right word is, the role of other people, right? I mean, if I have a chemical imbalance and my family can't help me, so you saw a lot of this where people would talk about the role of family or friends only in terms of encouraging them to see an expert, go see a doctor, right, and so on. But they played no role in the care of the person. If you've seen drug ads for like antidepressants, they almost always show the sufferer as an isolated figure, right? And then they have a before and after, is normally the dynamic. And in the before picture, i.e. before drug, they're usually portrayed as this isolated figure. Then you have the after picture, right? And in the after picture, they're often kind of with their family and children again, right? But what's interesting is, why isn't the family and children with them in their suffering, right? All right. It's only
Yeah.
after the drug that does the work. It's the drug that helps you, not those people. So their role, again, if I have a chemical imbalance, then what good are my friends? They can't help me with something like that.
Oh,
They can help me understand my emotions. They can help me think through my relationships, think through my situation, think through the struggles I'm having at work, all those human messiness. Well, they could potentially help with that if they're good friends. But when you get to a biological problem, then they get sort of demoted. And then one last one I'll add, I think there's a longer list here, but one last is the way it kind of naturalizes the norms. And I gave some examples in the book, right? If you're shy, right, then the shyness is attributed to a chemical imbalance, as though normal is to be outgoing,
There's
right?
a sort of self-alienation going on there, right?
Yeah, the
You
normal is to be outgoing, or the normal is to have all this the normal kid, the normal boy can sit for 7 hours in a classroom without fidgeting, right? That becomes right? And it becomes normal by saying, if you can't do it, then you might have a problem that we need to treat. And so in that sense, when the doctor is treating a kid for ADHD, right, it seems like you're not uh, uh, making any judgment of them, or right, you're just or that saying, hey, you're a bad boy, because you're active, right? What you do is simply say, oh no, you've got a problem. You've got a problem in your brain, and the drug will help treat the problem in your brain, right? And so that kind of capacity to sit still or to not be shy or whatever gets kind of, maybe I'm not saying this quite right, but it gets kind of naturalized, so that rather than dealing with a social norm, you're dealing with some kind of brain problem. It's like a natural norm, not a social norm that you're violating. And that seems to me another really subtle but problematic issue here, is that when you're not living up to these expectations, right? It's not said that way. It's said, you're neurodivergent or something like that, and that's the problem. And
Yeah.
and when you do that kind of talk, then it seems to me like the norm to be outgoing becomes a natural norm, and everyone is expected to have it. So, so anyway, that's what I mean by kind of naturalizing norm. Uh, 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 and often, they be kind of insidious and unjust norms that we're trying to conform to. Anyway, so those are a few things I think that the consequences.
Yeah. Paul, I would ask you if you have any other questions or anything to add, but I think we're at time, so I'm just going to cut you off.
No, you should, because I feel like we're just getting into it. I wish we had another hour.
I know.
But go ahead, Kyle.
I know. Yeah, I have the same feeling, and I want to say thank you to everyone for being here for the Hedgehog After Hours and for the great questions. Many of them we did not get to. And I want to say especially thanks to Joe Davis for talking to us about this great book. This is a great conversation. It's called Chemically Imbalanced: Everyday Suffering, Medication, and Our Troubled Quest for Self-Understanding. As I said earlier, I would hold up my book, but I gave it to a friend because I thought it was so good.
And I got to toss in here. I got to say one more thing, Kyle. Gary Fine made one more comment. He said, Joe's book right now is available on Amazon in the Kindle edition for $3.99, but he recommends the hardback at $100.
Yeah,
so
get the hardback. $100. That's what Joe would want you to do.
This paperback's not that expensive.
That's somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, that's actually much more affordable. Well, thank you all very much. Please join us for our next after hours discussion with UVA politics professor John Owen. We're going to talk about his book, The Ecology of Nations, and that will be on Tuesday, November 19th at 7 o'clock Eastern. And please go to hedgehogreview.com to subscribe to the Hedgehog Review and to read more of Joe's writing and Paul's writing and many other great essays. Thank you all very much, and we'll see you soon. Have a good night.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Joe.